Hi guys, my name's Allison and my disease is poliomyelitis. So here we can see a couple images of people who have poliomyelitis. You can see a trend in the disfigurement in their limbs, so their arms, their legs, their backs. And so an introduction into what poliomyelitis is. Here we go. Let me just start from the beginning. Um, Poliomyelitis, otherwise known as the paralytic disease, is a highly infectious, debilitating disease that can affect the brain and the spinal cord, which can result in paralysis and death. So the formal name is poliomyelitis, and then some of the common names you might hear for poliomyelitis are polio, infantile paralysis, and then Hindman's disease. It is in the family of Picornaviridae, which houses a numerous amount of diseases y'all might be familiar with, including but not limited to meningitis, paralysis, hepatitis, and even the common cold. So, going forward, here's a taxonomic grouping of the poliomyelitis. Because it is a virus, it does not have a specific nomenclature trend that we are familiar with, such as binomial nomenclature, but it's in the genus of Enterovirus. It is a species of the Enterovirus C, and then the virus is obviously the poliovirus. Um, and so some of the characteristics of polio. So the poliovirus is around 25 to 30 nanometers. Its capsid is composed of around 60 protomers, each made of 4 virin proteins. So VP1, VP2, VP3, VP4, and they're all in icosahedral symmetry. And so to help y'all kind of picture that, here's an image here of the poliovirus, given its relative shape, size, appearance. The poliovirus is a single-stranded RNA virus with positive polarity and a non-envelope capsid. And here in this image here, you can see depressions, otherwise known as canyons on the virin surface, which is pretty cool actually. And then its genomic dRNA is approximately 7,400 to 7,500 nucleotides in length. So how does the poliovirus invade the body? So the poliovirus enters via the nose or the mouth, and then it reproduces and replicates in the throat and the gut. And then in more severe cases, which is not as common, the virus can enter via the bloodstream, in which it invades the central nervous system and then damaging the motor neurons. And so the incubation period is around 2 to 35 days. The cell receptor CD155 is on the host motor neurons, which allows for the attachment and entry through an irreversible conformational change of the viral particle. And then the viral nucleic acid can enter via two routes. So we have the formation of the pore in the plasma membrane, and then the virus uptake by cellular mediated endocytosis. And then experimental evidence through time proves or supports the latter. And then some of the history surrounding polio. So Michael Underwood actually gave the first clinical description of polio. And then it was recognized a condition by physician Jacob Hine. Charles Caverly recognized polio could occur without paralysis. And then the most interesting part, hear me out. Carl Landsteiner and Erwin Popper, what they did is they injected filtered preparations of the spinal cord of infected individuals. So they took the liquid from the spinal cord of someone who died of polio and they injected it into monkeys. And then the monkeys developed polio. And then through that, they were able to deduce that polio is highly contagious. And I think that's pretty cool. And so lastly, we have Hillary Koprowski, who actually found the vaccine, the first vaccine for the poliovirus. And he discovered this by um, drinking the oral vaccine. And then he didn't suffer any ill effects. So there we go. And then we have three strains of the poliovirus. We have type 1, type 2, and type 3. All these strains are identical in that they can have or produce the same effect being paralysis and or death. And then there are also genetic variants, which separates the strains out in terms of how we can eradicate poliovirus completely, especially in the United States. And we must think about how we eradicate them individually because of these genetic variants. Um, and so the most virulent is type 1, the least virulent being type 2. Actually, the type 2 strain of the virus was last seen in 1999 in India. Type 3 was declared eradicated in 2012, actually. And then type 1 is the only one that's still existing today, which is, we'll get into. It's in more of our less developed countries such as Afghanistan and Pakistan, but I'll get into that later in the presentation. And so now we have outbreaks. So the first incident occurred in 1894, and then to now, where we are almost at complete eradication. So in the United States, we can see here in this graph, in the 1950s, there was a great amount of cases of paralysis in people who have polio. And in 1952, actually, there was a peak in 58,000 reported cases with 3,000 plus deaths. And then you can see by the 1960s and 1970s, so through these next couple decades, the amount of cases of paralysis and polio decreased significantly. And we can describe this because of the implementation of the IPV and the OPV vaccines, which I'll get into later into the presentation. Um, but yeah, and then since 1979, we have not seen any acquired polio cases from the US. And then moving forward, we have countries such as Afghanistan and Pakistan. So Afghanistan and Pakistan are our only two polio endemic countries right now. In the last 5 years, we've seen 100% of our reported cases come from Afghanistan and Pakistan. And we can describe the prevalence due to a variety of things, such as the lack of hospitable care, lack of vaccines, affordable vaccines, but we can greatly describe this trend based upon the cross-border movement of unimmunized populations, which give rise to the reflux in the amount of polio cases in these underdeveloped countries. And so some of the symptoms of the poliovirus are very similar actually to the common cold. So we have fatigue, fever, headache, nausea, vomiting, a sore throat. Um, but then the difference lies in the pain in the limbs. So people with polio typically experience pain in their legs, but they can also experience pain in their arms, legs, back, etc. And then in more severe cases, it can last anywhere from 30 to 40 years. And then in the greatest severe of polio cases, we have lifelong paralysis, which is not good. Some of the other body parts that the poliovirus can affect is the spinal cord, the brain, the central nervous system, which destroys the motor neurons. We can see pain in limbs, on the lungs, and then the brain stem. And so, how do doctors necessarily diagnose polio? So, they diagnose polio through specimens in the throat, feces, stool, and the cerebral fluid. Blood tests are often used to test if the suspected individual has or produces antibodies. And if they produce a mass amount of antibodies, we can deduce that the patient has polio. Doctors can also base their diagnosis on the subjective opinions of the patient. So they experience neck and back stiffness, abnormal reflexes, difficulty swallowing and breathing. But again, these are very subjective, so we can only rely on specimens, blood tests, etc. And so giving that gives way to the treatment of polio. There is no cure, unfortunately, but there is the OPV and IPV vaccines available, which have proven the greatest effect in the eradication of the polio virus in the United States. There's physical and occupational therapy. for patients who experience arm and leg weakness because it helps stimulates the muscle. And then lastly, we have antispasmodic drugs, which are given to relax the muscles. All right. And then we have how is polio spread? So, like I said before, polio is highly contagious. It is spread through direct contact with an infected individual and or their feces. And so this is just going more into depth. It's person-to-person contact, contact with stool of an infected individual. And if this infected individual expels um, infected droplets via, for example, coughing and sneezing, it can spread the polio virus. Um, and so that gives way to the preventative measures we can take. Obviously, we can wash our hands, do not drink and eat after other people, being very mindful of public pools, lakes, any other public areas, especially our children, because children are actually more prone to developing polio because it does occur in, or it does primarily occur in children ages 5 and below. Um, and then obviously if you're traveling to more polio endemic countries, just make sure you have your polio booster. And then lastly, we have the IPV and OPV vaccines, the inactivated polio vaccine, the oral polio vaccine. They are proven to have the greatest effect in eradicating polio. So, alrighty. And now we have polio today. So the polio virus is almost at complete eradication, and that we are still continuing to research and study how we can completely eradicate the virus completely. So in this graph here, we can see a trend in the United States with the amount of polio cases decreasing through time. And then here we can see just about complete eradication. And then in this graph here, you can see in other countries, especially our lower developed countries, we can see a similar trend to this graph here, where we see a decrease in polio cases, but there's still being some still polio cases, but not much. And so that giving way to the vaccines, doctors and researchers are striving to optimize OPV efficacy, and they are developing ways to where we can make the IPV vaccine more affordable, especially in our two polio endemic countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Um, and then some of the fun, cool facts you probably didn't know about polio. Um, Franklin D. Roosevelt actually had polio. In this image here, you can see this is Franklin D. Roosevelt. He seems to have a disfigurement or discomfort in his right leg. Yeah, it's right leg. Um, and so polio is often also mentioned in ancient Egyptian paintings and carvings. So in here, we can see this man here also in his right leg having a disfigurement. And then here at this base, you can see this man, his spine has a disfigurement as well, which is very fascinating to kind of think of back then polio existed, but especially during ancient Egyptian times. And then lastly, humans are the only natural host or reservoir for the poliovirus, but it can be experimentally introduced to primates through injecting high doses of the poliovirus into their central nervous system. Um, and so, that being said, that concludes my presentation of poliomyelitis. Thank you so much for watching, and y'all have a great day. Thank you.